So the result of these long videos is that you have a .NET C#, entirely .NET full stack C# base project that has the database configured, the authentication configured for both backend and frontend. Hey, let's continue with Blazor WebAssembly for the frontend. We'll implement authentication, navigation, and some more things. JavaScript interrupts. For authentication, we'll need validation in the front end and to access our local storage in the browser. But first, I made a few changes. First off, this backend API, shared backend API. Shared backend was the name of the project. I just renamed it to shared API since that makes more sense, and renamed this entry method add shared API in the shared API project and in the pet social API program. This one's called add shared API. And then I made a shared SPA. SPA stands for single page application, which is going to be the front-end Blazor WebAssembly project. The shared code for the front-end Blazor WebAssembly project. I made a configure services class with one method add shared SPA, which is quite similar as in the shared API. To do that, of course, I needed these packages, Microsoft Extensions configuration and dependency injection. Let me show you the actual packages are these. I don't like to use the preview versions, but I just copied those from the mailing project. Okay, so that's all I did. And then in the pet social folder, I made the actual front-end Blazor WebAssembly project. You can do this, of course, by just clicking add a new project, choosing Blazor WebAssembly, give it a name, of course, or by using the .NET CLI, something like .NET new thing Blazor WASM, maybe a name, specify a name with -n, and that should do it in the correct folder. Yeah. Okay, the point of this shared SPA project, of course, is to have code that I'm going to share over multiple front ends. Because my use case needs it, I'm going to make multiple progressive web apps sharing the same CSS, the same Blazor components. Code like authentication and for the local storage interaction and much more. Let's just create some empty folders first. It will make sense to share components, also services, probably the interfaces of those services. You can maybe put that in another folder. Of course, to implement this shared project, I had to go to the program.cs and add this line. It's quite similar as in the backend. You just call the extension function that you created in the configure services and pass down the configuration. Okay. We'll talk more about these head outlet things later, but let's not worry about it now. Let's focus on authentication and those good things. Of course, packages. Let me see, should I both install these packages in the shared project, or maybe we're just making things harder for ourselves, but let's just paste them here at the top. So it's Blazor Fluent Validation, and Blazor Local Storage. Okay. What I also did is change the launch settings and specify a fixed port for local development, and I removed all the IIS settings. Just a side note. Okay. Let's run our backend project as well so we can see the Swagger and see which endpoint to target. If it builds, yeah, it builds. So I have this pet social API that we built in previous videos. Okay. So what should we implement first? The authentication might be easiest, and then we can store the access token in the local storage so we can keep a user signed in. Let's do that first. Let's also make some I would say route beds. Let's make a constants folder. Constants. Let me call them route paths. So choose whatever you want to call it. And it's gonna contain a static class with some constants. Sorry, slipped my mind. Let's see what we want. Let's start with the authentication ones. Use something like this. Of course, an index. User profile will definitely use it. Yeah. Anyway, at least the login, registration, reset password, install app, confirm user, resend confirmation, email. It's not the best naming, but let's roll with it. Registration could maybe be register. Okay. Route paths. Let's make an AuthService. How am I going to call it? How did I call this one? AuthService. Well, just AuthService. Okay, let's just call it AuthService, but make the distinction in the interface ISPI AuthService. Like that. Let's make the interface ISPA service. Okay, like that. Okay. Spelling error. SPA AuthService. Okay. And I like to start this off with a base URL, but I haven't made it. Let's do that in the common constants class. I'd better call this API endpoints, endpoint routes. Let's just call it API routes. Is that correct? So going to be static class. And let's start with the obvious ones we want, the ones we made. I'll say it like that. Just 3 of them. Let's call this API routes. Okay. Okay, I noticed I need to add some other things. So this HTTP client just uses the base address right now. We wanted to use our backend host address. For that, we'll adjust our we'll go to our www root folder, make a JSON file, call it, or could we make an app settings file directly? Let's see, config for app settings file, app settings.json. We want that, and we want another one for development, app settings dot development dot JSON. That should work. I don't know if we need those logging objects. What I want to add is the where our backend resides. I'm going to call this backend config, and then the port. Specify the port. Oh, we're actually in the production settings right now. Let's add this to the development settings. Backend config. Let's double check where it's running. Yeah, that's correct. And I actually also want a front-end config. I'm gonna leave it empty for now. And we need to access this. I'm going back to the program CS. Let's see, we'll have to do this before we create this client. Project config is actually backend config. Still need those to make those classes. Let's do that. Shared SPA for the folder config. Backend config. And it should only have a, let's see, base URL at the moment. Okay, that should do it. And then we need to use this base URL instead of this build it at host environment. Backend config.base URL. Okay, that should be good. I'm not going to need this. Oops. Okay. So now we should be good to go to start calling our backend. Let's maybe try to run our Blazor project. And have it open. Oops, on this one. It's running on port 5006. Yeah, in the meanwhile, I started running the Blazor project. For some reason, the recording stopped. I'm not seeing anything. That's probably because I removed almost everything. So I've got this index. Yeah, of course. It's just say hello. I'm not using hot reload, so unfortunately, we just say hello. That's fine. One thing we forgot is to register the Blazor. Register the Blazor local storage package. Let's do that. And let's define some methods in the interface of AuthService. Interfaces, AuthService. Okay, let's remove the ones we don't need for now. Some methods. Let's see if we can take this one. Yep, from the common project. Auth tokens response. I'm gonna have to make that one. That should be just a smaller version of. Sorry. Should be in the features auth responses. Should be just a smaller version of the authentication response. Oh, oops. Let's make a record auth tokens response. If I'm not mistaken, auth token response. And that just has a access token and refresh token. Okay. Let's implement those in our service. See what it does. Okay. We definitely need a constructor. Okay. First thing we should do, of course, is log the user in. But we don't have a login form yet. So I could make that first, but I don't have any styling at the moment. Maybe I should. do that first. Let's see what it gives without styling. It's gonna be horrible, but okay. I'm going to make a component. I like to make forms folder first. Or should I go by feature? Maybe. Might be wiser to go by feature. Let's create an auth folder. And maybe a forms folder underneath. And add a component. Oops. My IDE is not helping me to adding components. I see. Okay, that's not ideal, but LoginForm dot razor. Is it razor? Yeah. LoginForm razor. Okay. Let's have a code block. Don't worry too much about styling and all that stuff. It's just using Bootstrap, so most should be familiar. It's using Fluent validation to validate the form. This edit form is a Blazor component. My IDE doesn't seem to give me good support here because I'm working outside of a Blazor project. And you see I'm working with translations, but let's undo those. Let's see, maybe I'm just going to comment those out if I can. Yeah, I'll put something else. Login failed. Just simple. Same for this button. And what should we call it? Sign in or login? Sign in. You have anything else? Password label. Sorry that you have to see all this. Password label would be just password, email password, okay. Then we'll need a model to bind to and a method to execute when form is valid. Local password visibility, something I custom has submit and is login success to display error messages according. Okay, I'm going to paste in the code. Yeah, this is something related to my previous project. Translations, I'm going to comment out. And login request we should be able to access. Should actually move those to the imports file, but I'll have to figure out how to do that. Since we're working in a shared project. We'll have to inject our service. API AuthService service. Okay. Login request is a record, and it seems to want some default values. That's not. Let's just initialize them with empty strings. Okay, navigation service will do later. Okay, it seems like we can't use records for binding forms. Okay. Let's make it a class, I guess, or could we do something else? I don't know. Keep it a record? Don't think so. Okay. This should be fixed now. And let's just implement this on our index page for now. LoginForm. I wonder if it's going to find it. Am I doing something wrong with the... I would think maybe need to make this Blazor or something. But no, the documentation doesn't say so. Or maybe these packages. Aha, I think I created the wrong type of class library. It might have been a Razor class library I needed. Okay. What should we do? Copy everything over. Let's just see how what it creates. What's all this? Delete. This one has a component. Okay, imports just this. Looks great. The WW root. Imports is just one thing. Let's take a look at the CS bridge. SDK.razor. Okay, that's what we need. Possibly this. Let's see. Okay, let's change our, let's add this package. Let's just add it all. And add this to our shared one. Replace this one. The package reference we can move here. Then the only thing here in need is Razor. Let's add a www root folder for later. Okay, let's remove this class library again. And let's see, we have this, and put this back. Into the forms. I'm going to move this into the imports. And looks like that works. Let's see now, rebuild. Let's see. And we have an error. Yeah, okay, we didn't register our AuthService. It's getting late, so my voice is getting boring. Okay, services dot. Oops. Add scoped. And let's get this one out. Have it here. Didn't I? Let's see. And let's paste the code in here. Login user. Make it async. Okay, this seems to need a couple of things. We're gonna call this request authentication result. This authentication response. Local storage thing we don't have yet. But we can access it. Let's do this. Initialize, and initialize. This one is just another constant. Let's make it local storage keys. With a public const string of tokens key or something. Tokens key equals, and we can call it, just gonna call it pet. Just the key of the key value pair that's gonna be stored in the local storage, which will have the authentication tokens. Merge into pattern. Okay, so what we're doing is we are posting something to our backend API. If it's not successful, we're going to let the component know that it was false, so we can handle it accordingly. And then we are going to, so that's just a request, the response we're getting, and then we're going to parse the content of the response to, yeah, so you see we're doing a post, but we're returning data, which is not something I usually do, but okay. And then it should be stored in the local storage. Let's try it. We seem to have a course error. That could be either because we didn't enable course on the backend, or because we called the wrong method, so a method that doesn't exist, or with the wrong payload. Could be all of those things. Let's check out the service first. This is a service base URL, which is the endpoint auth, should be the correct one. Email password, and we are posting email and the password. So then it's probably the course origin settings. Let's see where we should set that. And the API project program, and it's probably going to be something like use course thing. Okay, apparently my database wasn't running. Maybe that might have been the issue. Okay, let's see, use course options. We're just going to have lax options right now. how do you say it? Allow anything. We'll make it stricter later. Let's rerun it. Okay, and we don't seem to get an error anymore. So let's see. Let's take a look at our local storage. And we see very nicely the key path, our access token, and our refresh token. Hey, let's continue. And the AuthService, let's fix a few things. So here we're getting the authentication response, which contains a success boolean, possibly the user roles, and then the most important access token and refresh token. You could say maybe we want to map it directly to the auth response, but then don't have the success. The user roles, after all, we're not going to grab from this one, but you could. Maybe it wasn't very useful to include the user roles in here, but yeah, it's a possibility. Might be useful if you work with the application user directly. Okay, so quickly wanted to clean that up. And one thing we forgot is to authorize the requests from now on. And we can do it by, let's see, we have this HTTP client in here, by setting the default header of bearer token. So let's see if we can remove those. Should look like this. I saw examples where this bearer didn't start with a capital B, but this seems to work for me. Probably just gets lowercase in the request anyway, so. And all we do is set the default header, the authorization key, of course, and add as value bearer space. Yeah, well, I assume it's doing the space. And auth tokens.access token. And now all our requests should be authenticated. I think this code will probably want to do as well when refreshing the tokens, and maybe for another use case. So we could move this to a separate function or even a separate method somewhere, class. But let's not do that now. Let's fill out these methods, and I'm even going to add a method. We've got the log user in, the log user out. Let's see. Let's paste this one in here. This current user profile, we don't have it yet. Just something I like to have, let's sign user out, log user out. Let's just make sure the names are a bit consistent. Sign user in, sign user out. And we haven't added it to AuthService. Okay, all that's going to do is to clear the local storage, at least remove our access and refresh token from it, set our local variable to null, and reset the header, the authorization header to null. This method is just going to grab the auth tokens from the local storage. Make it async. And is never null. How is this never null? Anyway. Yeah, maybe we should call this get auth tokens from local storage instead of, yeah, well, we're kind of setting our variable by getting it from the local storage. Let's just call it get. There's some minor refactoring. And then we potentially want to refresh the token if the access token returns like a unauthorized or expired or something like that, because we want to keep the user signed in for until he or she actively logs out. Or let's fill up this method. We're not using it yet. Would be like this. Response. It's actually quite similar as the sign user in. So we're kind of posting but to a different endpoint. If this fails, we potentially have an invalid refresh token, so we're going to remove things. We're basically going to log the user out, so to speak. Maybe we could do that. We could move all of this into a private function. Private async task. Just gonna see what happens here. Response. Maybe we should put those back. Or I'm inclined to call this set auth state, but it's not a great name. Since it's, for me, it implies that I could like set it to true or false or something. But let's roll with it for now. Okay. The auth controller. There's a few things I want to clean up. The first will be, so if you run, the API, you should see something like this. Note, in previous video I had a bug here. I defined this method as post for some reason. Probably a copying mistake. This should be get, since it's implemented as get in our front end. Okay. So I just changed here this decorator to HTTP get and added the authorize attribute because we're accessing our current user, so our authenticated user and possibly authorized users data. We don't want anyone to be able to access this, of course. In this example, someone not authenticated wouldn't be able to see it, to get anything, of course. But okay, let's continue. A few things. This authentication response, this bool success is not really necessary. So let's remove that. Then we see we have access token and refresh token, which we copied over in a smaller version, smaller requests response, which is auth tokens. Where did I put this? Responses, auth token response. So, and then we have user roles and user ID, which is kind of something else. So I suggest we remove these and change his name to something like user response. I would say current user response. And these fields, user ID and user roles, come from the access token. So let me show you the current user service. So you see here the user ID comes from this HTTP context.user, this user object contains the claims we specified when creating a JWT access token. So this makes this current user response and refactor this. Okay, I was only using the user roles, but it's perfectly reasonable to include the user ID, since once you get the access token in the front end, you'll want to do what HTTP requests to the backend that need so the access token, but also the user ID if you want to get user-specific data from the database or from the API. So it's perfectly reasonable to include that user ID, and we can access it from the access token. Okay, let's refactor a little bit. So this would be, first I'm going to remove these. This would be current user response. And let's want to do it like that. Okay, then the login method. This is when the user submits a login form on the front end, which will return a valid access token and a refresh token if everything went successfully. And here I seem to want to, and here I also return the user ID and user roles, but actually we don't need those yet. Okay, so let's remove that. The auth response should only contain the access token and the refresh token. And on the register method, I just return no content. No content. We don't need that boolean is success or actually, because when we, from the front end at least, from the Blazor WebAssembly project, if we do an HTTP request to the backend, we'll either get a success response or an error response. So, and you can see that, let me quickly show that to you in the AuthService, which we'll have to refactor as well. But you see, for example, this response already has an isSuccess status code. So that's going to be, like it says, 200 to 299. So if it, for example, returns a 401 or something, it's not successful. I'll keep it at that. So we don't need that is success boolean. That's just something I copied over from an example I followed a year or two ago. Let's dive into our, I see, refresh. So here as well, we don't need those user ID and user roles. Okay, let's dive into the AuthService, and we see Okay, so for the login, this will be an auth token response. For the refresh as well, auth token response. This does not need anything actually, but this is where we only specified like is success true or false, but we never actually, yeah, no. Okay, these as well, these methods are not going to need a response. So let's see, that's the service of course. Okay. Let's see how we'll handle this. So we are actually using that boolean, my bad. But let's see if we can fix that. Okay, let's just go to this AuthService. Sorry, this is the front end. Let's close everything. Shared API, AuthService. Okay, so going to undo those. Okay, it seems like this video is going to be longer than anticipated again. Okay, this one should be auth tokens. Tokens response. No, this should have no response at all. I'm sorry. Wow. Register. Register should just send the confirmation email when everything went through fine. And in the end, it returns a authentication response. Let's undo that. Stop task, task. Okay. This one inherits from API service. Okay, then our base service is complaining. We won't be needing these user roles and when logging in or refreshing the tokens. Let's see, did we catch all the errors? doesn't need to return anything. We'll have to test all this because okay, login needs a auth token response, and that should be it. Yet this auth-based service interface we'll have to fix. Seems like we fixed it. Why is it complaining? Turn type is void. Let's see. No, I don't really need to return it. Anything. Okay. It's funny how I think I'm just going to make a video about explaining things and not getting tripped up by refactoring and demoing, but I seem to always end up doing that, which in turn takes my focus away of explaining things and properly demoing things. Okay. Okay, this is in the, let's stick with the API for now. So we'll have to edit the auth controller, and I'm going to remove all these. And test it. It's possible, of course, that this one was working together with the validation exceptions possibly thrown inside the method. So, for example, when creating a new user, let's say the user already exists, it's possible that those validation exceptions are working together with this one. So then the auth response success is false. By default, it's false since we didn't get to the end of the register method where it's specified as true. And then it returns a bad request with those validation messages. So in most cases in API development, it doesn't really make sense to return anything when posting. In MVC context, it might be different, but okay. Let's clean this up. I don't know why I comment this out. Okay. Let's test it. And let's, we have something else to fix before we can run everything without errors. And we'll try to, on purpose, have some validation exceptions. And we'll fix those. I have one more error. What is this going to be? Parse auth response. It's called set auth state or something. I renamed it to parse auth response, but I will explain it. I will go over all the code in a bit while attempting to explain the full authentication flow from front end to back end. This one is going to be an auth tokens response. Won't have a success. My comment here says shouldn't happen, so maybe we can remove the if statement altogether. This would be, let me think about it. Even if this authors, let's just test it. Okay, let's rerun the backend project API. Rerun it. Tab is, let's see. Okay. Can remove it. Let's see. Well, I want to run into a validation exception. So we're going to try to register the user that exists. tester30@gmail.com. Name. Oh yeah, okay. Tester30. Phone number. Let's just say my actual language. Let's see what happens. And we just get the validation exception just fine. So it doesn't seem like we needed that that is success boolean or neither and we didn't have to throw those bad requests exceptions, so that's pretty cool. The reason I had that, I'm gonna say it again, is because I used different sources to have all this authentication logic in the backend. So I followed an example there, didn't think too much about it a year ago or 2 years ago. And then I used the clean architecture of Jason Taylor project, which specified this validation exception handling. So yeah, I combined those sources without really using one or the other. I just used both incorrectly. Okay. So let's quickly demonstrate what's going to happen in, let's just test out our whole authentication flow in the backend first. So we want to authenticate. So log a user in using an existing user, of course, that we registered once before. And it should be an active account, so the user should have activated his or her account through his or her email, the received email, execute, and then we get just a access token and refresh token. Using this access token, we can from now on authenticate our HTTP requests and get user specific data, or like data that should only be available after authorization. So that's why we have this auth me endpoint, which is going to extract the current user ID and user roles from the access token. So this access token we just authorized with. And let's see, we get a nice user roles and user ID response. With this user ID, of course, we can start, for example, getting let's say my personal shopping cart, or the personal shopping cart for that user, which will probably have such a use case in our application. Okay, so let's now dive into the front end. Let's first demonstrate a few possible use cases in existing applications. Okay, so this is what I call an authorized view. And let's say I would navigate to login. So an unauthorized view in my use case, I would get redirected to a page. Since I'm already logged in, it's no use for me to see the login form, okay? Unless I sign out. This is the sign out one. So let me sign out. Just notice this page setup has a navigation bar and content and all that stuff. If I sign out, I'll be redirected to an unauthorized view. This. And all my user forms have the same layout, but just different forms. So let's say I forgot my password, it's just gonna show a similar view, login or register. It's gonna be all quite similar, but this doesn't have a navigation bar. This has a completely different page setup, page layout. If I try to, let's say, go to maintenance now, I won't be able to. I'll get redirected to the login form. Okay. So just know authorized view is what we see when we were authenticated. In this use case, an unauthorized view is what we should only see when we're not authenticated. Okay. Another use case is that you have both. So if you're not authenticated, you'll just see the app, but with limited functionality. For example, this is my personal name, so I'm authenticated. If a user wasn't authenticated, it would just see welcome. This is welcome in my native language. If a user was not authenticated in this use case and it would try to access my profile, it would see a login form instead of the actual profile. So in this case, we can have both. But that, anyway, I hope that was somewhat clear. So now let's dive into the components. So the Blazor WebAssembly project, and go over the flow. So in components, auth, I made 3 components. Similarly, as I just explained, I have an authorized layout. So remember the dashboard when I was logged in. I have a auth state layout, which is kind of the authentication manager, which is going to decide whether I'm authenticated and authorized or not, and redirect me if needed accordingly. So if not authenticated or not authorized, it's going to redirect me, for example, to the login form or to a page I can access when I try to access a page I can't access, such things. And this unauthorized layout is actually not really important. This is just like I showed in the dashboard example, a layout I only want to show users that are not authenticated. Okay, let's start with the simplest one, unauthorized layout. I removed all the HTML, but actually I just made this for all the pages like login, registration, reset password, forgot password, all those pages. I just wanted the same layout. So this is not the most important component. What is important, however, is it has this auth state layout, which is listening to our authentication state. So let's say I'm seeing this authorized layout and suddenly I'm actually authenticated. It's potentially going to redirect me to the authorized layout, some page using the authorized layout. Since this auth state layout in our first example will have logic to redirect me whether I'm authenticated or not. Okay. So let's just add a p tag that's not the, or let's see, a div. Put this child content in. It's just for demo purposes, and say only unauthenticated users should see this. This might backfire when I'm demoing. And child content is just going to be, for example, the login form component or register form component, such things. Let's now take a look at the authorized layout. This is a little more, this has a little more functionality and things. This is also listening to this auth state layout. And when the user is authenticated, it's going to notify, at least call this method, which tells us we are authenticated and we received the user ID and the user roles in our example. And this handle, what this handle, this actually checks. So at this point we're authenticated, but in here we're actually checking if we're authorized, so if we have the sufficient permissions. So it's checking if the required policy is null. This means a page implemented this component using without specifying a user should have, for example, admin access to see this page. Without such a thing, if a access level is required, so user should have admin access, it's going to check whether the current user actually has that one. If it's true, of course, it's gonna show the page or redirect to the page. If it's false, it's not. It's going to kick you out. I mean, either stay on the same page or just redirect back to a page you can access. Anyway, and we are going to letting the pages or components that implement this component know that we have received an authenticated user and have checked the authorization. But of course, the authorization, this is only meant to notify, so to tell these pages or components that we can access the user object. So we can start calling the backend using the user ID and all that stuff. Okay, anyway, I skipped this has access. If we have access, we are going to show the child content. So imagine the dashboard, so with the nav layout and the maintenance options, all that stuff. And in this case, we just say else no access. But chances are we're never going to see this no access and we'll just get redirected out of what we wanted to access. Let's see. And here we also have this on current user set, so which is going to notify the pending components. In our case, only our authorized layout or a page that implements this component directly. Notify that we from then on can access the user object, authenticated user object. What we do here when we initialize this component, we register an event specified in the AuthService, excuse me. And when this event changes or is invoked, a change is invoked, something like that, we want to call this handle auth state. So every time something changes, in our case, in our authentication state, we're going to handle the change in this method in here. But we have to, since it's an event we're listening to, so to say, we have to register it using the plus equals, something typically C#. And when, of course, when we dispose this component, go to a page that doesn't implement this, for example, I think, whatever. We just want to undo this, we want to stop listening to this auth state change. It's not a perfect explanation, but I hope you get the idea. And here in this auth state change, this is actually where the logic is, the redirection logic is going to happen. So we could say if we see AuthService, if we let's say we just load the page and we log in, logs us in automatically, and we have the administrator role. We could say I want to navigate you directly to the admin page, for example. And you could say, like in our first example, else navigate to the index page or something. Let's just change this because we only have the app user access. Let me change this to that. Okay. Knowing this, let's just quickly take a look at the auth service. You can also see this. This is the event I was talking about, and this is a private method. We can actually invoke this event. So make sure all the components listening to this event get notified. In our case, this is just auth state layout, but auth state layout is used on multiple pages or components. Anyway, something we might have skipped over, this initialize auth state. We had called this set current user, but I changed the name to init auth state. Okay, let's see the implementation. What we do here is, so let's say this auth state layout is used on our index page. It's going to immediately call this init auth state. And this init auth state gets our auth tokens, at least tries to get our auth tokens from the local storage, if there are any, and then immediately fetch our current user. Notice this was called get user current user profile or something. I renamed it to keep, yeah, I fixed it. I'll say it like that. Fetch the current user, which will call our API endpoint auth me, which would return the user roles and user ID. Okay. If there are no auth tokens, it's just going to return and possibly redirect us to the login page. That's what we'd expect to happen. But let's demo that in a bit. Set the authentication header token if we have an access to if we have an access token in our local storage. And this is just making sure from now on we have this. We have the HTTP calls to our backend authorized, so to say, with the bearer access token. I moved this to its own method. Okay, and then we're going to try to get the current user ID and current user roles, since we'll need it down below for checking whether we have permissions and all those things, or to do other authenticated calls specifically for this user. Like I mentioned, for example, get the shopping cart items for that authenticated user. If this is successful, we are going to just set the current user. That's just some properties I define in here. We're going to access throughout our application. Set current user, just doing that. If it didn't, so if we got a unauthorized exception, it's possible that our access token is expired. So we're going to attempt to refresh the tokens, assuming we have an access token and a refresh token, and a valid refresh token. It's going to call this refresh endpoint from our API. If that was not successful, we possibly have an invalid refresh token. And we are going to unset everything related to the authentication state. So this was called sign user out, but that seemed a weird name. So I made a different method, which this is also called when a user actively logs out using the user interface. So you see log user out. I changed the name from sign user out to log user out for consistency. And this is just going to call this unset auth state. Unset auth state, what it does, like I said, unset everything related to the authentication state. So the auth tokens null remove from the local storage, since we potentially have an invalid refresh token and all those things. We want to force the user to use the login form again, so to say. We're going to set all of these to null. We're going to make sure our HTTP client is not using the current access token anymore. So we're unsetting this default header, this one. We're basically setting this to null. And then we are going to notify our listening components to say, oh, the auth state is changed. In our case, we're not authenticated anymore. So this is going to happen when either something goes wrong or the user logs out. Okay. Notice and then, yeah, in the success scenario, we're just going to parse the auth response. Before this was called set auth state, but I refactored it to parse auth state. It made more sense to me, which is just going to read the auth token response and set the necessary fields accordingly. Also this auth header, this default header. Set the local storage with our new auth tokens, so the new access and refresh token. Okay. This parse auth response is called when we refresh the token. So when we want to keep the user automatically signed in, but also when we the user actively logged in using a user form, we're going to parse this auth response. Okay, so also using the log user in, this return true seems a bit extra. Just refactor that. Since after the new tokens are set, it's going to call this init auth state again. So get the tokens from the local storage and fetch the current user and notify the necessary components that the auth state changed. Okay, let's quickly log user in. This pool shouldn't be there. That is going to is login success. Just remove that for now. Since we're kind of assuming, I could probably copy this from projects not properly implementing our authentication redirection logic. In our case, the auth state layout will redirect to the index if our auth state changed to authenticated and authorized. Anyway. And last but not least, we will want to know or have a simple way of knowing whether we're logged in or not. And how I'm checking this is just seeing if the current user ID is set, is not empty or not null. So demo time. Kind of demoed existing projects already. Let's see what we can achieve with this newly set up project. Just going to remind you that if the user has app user access, which we will with the user I'm going to test with, we're going to navigate to the admin page. Okay, so let's make a component, a page, call it login. Let's lowercase this. And let's do the unauthorized layout and the login form. Then again, this unauthorized layout is just how I use it should only be seen by unauthenticated, unauthorized users. Unauthenticated users, actually. This is just the same as doing auth state layout. So just the only purpose this has is listening to this auth state, redirecting accordingly if we happen to be authenticated while being on this page. Let's see if, for demo purposes, just see if we can show the user ID. Let's say user ID shouldn't be the case, but okay. Oops. And I'm going to copy this one. Okay, and let's change some redirection logic. I really hope this doesn't backfire on me. Let's say we can say if AuthService user logged in, let's say not logged in, navigation manager dot navigate to. Oops. Can we actually? Let's just hard code it from now. For now, it should be login. The order in which you put the if statements matter, of course. For example, if I were to say if has app access user navigate to, let's say, just the index page, and underneath I would say specify a higher role, so has admin access user, has admin access. But admin also has the app user access, so it would redirect an admin to the same thing as it would redirect an app user, for example, for this example. Anyway, let's just change this to not be confusing to, okay, I'm using this navigation manager, not our custom. Let's just, for demo purposes, app user, make this page. I'm going to delete. Okay. So this is where you would write all these redirection logic. Let's see if this is going to work. If not is logged in, go to logged in, login. If app user, go to app user. So the index page should remain neutral. Let's see. Going to copy over this sign out button to the app user page. Maybe also to the admin page. The app user page is going to need something similar. Yeah, we're kind of undoing the purpose of the admin page. Okay, let's remove this app user page and just rename this admin page to app user, since it has all the logic already. Oops. And do this the route app user. Required policy, let's say, has app user access. Initialize, yeah, whatever. Let's copy the same user ID, check, just display it. Okay, we can remove let's just keep this if statement. Oops. The index page should just redirect us. Let's see. since it's listening to the auth state layout. Actually, sorry, let me let's just do demo per demo. Let's run this and let's see what happens. Did I? Oh, I rerun the backend project. Let's rerun this one. Let's see what happens. If we can. Okay. Let's see if we, oops, let's inspect this page. Let's see what are, we don't have any anything in the local storage. So the user ID is empty. Only unauthenticated users should see this. And we redirect to the login page. So test at gmail.com, test1234. We log in and we get redirected to the app user page, which incorrectly has this title yet still, and we can access the user data. If we sign out, we should be redirected to the login page. And we see there's no user ID and all those things. Okay, that demo went fine. That is similarly as the first use case I showed you with the admin dashboard. Let's see if we can replicate the second use case where you could be either authenticated or not authenticated and have extra functionality when you are authenticated or see something different. Okay. In that second use case, we wouldn't use the unauthorized layout. This unauthorized layout was purely for having similar pages without having to duplicate the same HTML for the login form page and for the register form page and for the, yeah. Hope you understand. So to replicate, we are going to set a few of these things back. And let's see, let's just let's say init method, private void init. This is not the lifecycle method. And let's set this is logged in to AuthService.loggedIn. Since we can't just directly use this AuthService.loggedIn, because this potentially, when we load the page, it will be false, and then maybe after a few milliseconds it will be true, but it won't have updated, or at least the AuthService will not trigger this component to update. So I can demo that. Actually run into such a bug. It's actually a feature, it's not a bug, but that Blazor partially updates the component instead of entirely re-renders the component, which is probably more efficient on Blazor's behalf. So let's see. Let's copy over this. Let's change this one to app user. Let's copy over this. And so we both have this AuthService is logged in. Should be, and let's for demo purposes also use the lifecycle method, which will be called before we actually refreshed the before we actually got our current user. So let's see, what can we do here? Let's say, just for purpose's sake, private string user ID gets set. Let's set this user ID to AuthService.user ID, which is potentially null. And let's make a, maybe I'm making it a bit confusing. Anyway, currently we're not ever going to see the index page, so let's change this redirection logic to, if the user is not logged in, we can go to the login page. If he is logged in, we just skip this for now. We want to stay on the index. We'll want to, so we end up on the index page automatically, by default, I mean. And let's maybe, let's see. We'd want to like have an else in here, an a href to, let's say, login. Okay, to login form, I'll just call it this. To, let's say, if it's logged in, we want to navigate to the index. So now we should automatically be navigated to the index. You see user ID and user ID both. And the top one has nothing. Since, yeah, as I mentioned, this onInitialize lifecycle method, so from the component, from the page, is called before we actually authenticated. So this thing is null at that moment in time, which makes this one, the top user ID, empty. That's exactly why I have this init method to know when we are in the init method, we do have access. We are authenticated and we do have access to the current user ID, which, because this is logged in is set, it re-renders the component after this one. So when this was called, because of our authentication state changed. So if is logged in, we have the user ID printed. Let's see, in our case, this one is also printed, AuthService that is logged in. possibly because of the same re-rendering happened caused by this is logged in. And I hope both use cases were clear. So you can have extra functionality when the user authenticated by simply checking or by simply waiting for the user to be authenticated, and that it wasn't possible on the default lifecycle method. Okay. The last thing I wanted to show you is, as far as I know, has nothing to do with how I implement authentication, but rather something Blazor specific, how Blazor works, a feature or a bug. I think it's a feature, but it took me a while. The first time I implemented authentication, it took me a while to figure it out. So I would like to warn you about it, maybe. So let's say we make, I hope that I can fully demonstrate it. Let's say we make a nav layout that just has some, just gonna mimic this. Let's say something like nav LE, another one, list items. So a nav bar having some nav menu items, and I'm going to inject SPA admin AuthService, and I'm going to say item 1, and for the second item I might say welcome. Yeah, it makes no sense that this is an item, but let's just say AuthService dot, or let's maybe say that if it's more realistic, probably if AuthService bunt is looked in, dot is looked in, sorry, we are going to show the second menu item, which is only for authenticated, or in this case authenticated users. Let's just say something like that. And we implement this in the index page. It's a bit similar as this user ID, only being empty. Only that it's okay. Let's just do it and not try to like this. So this is the component, depending on that needs to know whether the user is authenticated. And what I hope to see is that this is going to stay null even when the user is set. Let me run everything. Okay, so like you see here, You saw the user IDs were empty and suddenly they were set. So the user is authenticated automatically because we have the access token and refresh token in our local storage. We are only using the access token, which was still valid. We didn't refresh the token or anything, but we did log in using this access token. And what you see here is this nav layout does not show the the nav layout component is not re-rendered according to the auth state after the auth state changed. And why might that be? That's like I said, it's like I said, it's probably the way Blazor WebAssembly works, and only partially updates this page. This is logged in. This triggers, setting this logged in triggers a re-render. So what's happening here? Inside this is logged in, it will re-render. So these HTML components will update because of thanks to this is logged in. But actually, since this is logged in is a field on this page, sorry, a property on this page, it will re-render most of the page. So it will re-render the whole page, but not like not reinitialize, so to speak. So that's why this user ID stays empty, but and yet this is updated. If I were to copy this, and let's for simplification remove this for visual simplification. If I were to do this, like you have the navigation directly in here, it should re-render correctly since this AuthService is logged in. It's just the same as this one. So it does re-render, which is good, but it, as you see, it doesn't update child components. So you could force that by just adding a non-trivial parameter, so like something like re-render, and set this to is logged in or something that is logged in, since this will then be passed to the layout, which will then call the on parameter set thing. This will trigger, which will make this update, this component update. So like this with this parameter, let's test it. And we're exactly seeing, so I rerun the project. So by rerunning the project, you see exactly the item 2 is filled in. It's visible and filled in. That's thanks to this re-render parameter, which is okay. Let me see if this would work. This logged in. Let's just see if it works. We're kind of diving into how Blazor WebAssembly updates its views. And this also seems to work. So it's not really. It's just has to access something in the parent page or component and be passed down, because parent view updates and will make sure this is triggered. Okay, that's all For Blazor WebAssembly authentication, so Web API authentication. With this, I'm finishing this series. Upcoming series will be more about small components, for example, file uploads, also full stack, so from the front end to the back end, to some kind of blob storage, maybe in Azure, and fun things like that. Ciao.